Hello, I'm LegenTerry, and this is Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon, a mech combat action game developed by From Software and published by Bandai Namco. Armored Core is a pretty old series that you might not have heard of before, but I can almost guarantee that you know of the studio who made it. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the games that would go on to compose the Souls-like genre were but a glint in the eye of Hidetaka Miyazaki. Before they became behemoths in the industry, From Software cut their teeth on the PlayStation 1 with a few smaller titles, including Armored Core. Now, Armored Core is a pretty unique beast. You don't see a lot of fingers in the mech action pie these days. The most recent popular example I could come up with off the top of my head would probably be Titanfall, and Titanfall 2 is already 7 years old without a sequel in sight at this point. But Armored Core offers a completely different style of gameplay experience from Respawn Entertainment's jump in, jump out first-person shooter. I should probably begin by saying I'm not very well versed in the ways of Armored Core. My introduction was playing either Project Phantasma or Master of Arena once at a friend's apartment when I was super young, and that's my only touchstone for the series. I'm also not a huge Souls-like fan. Because of those facts, I've been a little apprehensive about this release. It feels like the only reason I didn't find myself attracted to From's other IP is because I don't particularly enjoy the dark fantasy horror vibes of their worlds. They never felt like a place I wanted to spend hours upon hours slowly struggling through. But the high-octane trailers for Armored Core 6 and the reputation of the devs alone were enough to make me raise an eyebrow. I still just wasn't sure if this one would be for me either. After about 15 hours, I'm happy to report my anxieties were slightly misplaced. While the world of Armored Core 6 is similarly desolate and hostile, it doesn't feel like it's trying to crush you into a fine paste under the weight of its difficulty. There are a few instances where it spikes, which we'll get into later, but for the most part, the toughness of the game comes from how well you've built your loadout and your ability to adjust to new situations. Let's start with the basics. The focus of Armored Core 6 is on its gameplay, and the story is pretty light. It's told in a much more direct way than From's other games, and while there is lore to be had, it's easy to understand what's going on without paying much attention to it. You play as a mercenary, codename 621, whose body has been augmented with cybernetic enhancements. These enhancements make you adept at piloting giant mecha known as armored cores, but have left you as little more than a husk of a human. For reasons unknown, you were put into the service of a man named Walter, who acts as your handler for combat missions. You're woken up as your AC is drifting through space aboard a rocket toward the planet Rubicon 3. An energy resource named coral was found there a long time ago, but it eventually became volatile and burned away most of the planet's surface. While only a few Rubiconians survived the tragedy, the rest of humanity has returned there to feud over any remaining coral, and this is where you're meant to work off your debts and buy back your life. However, some of the forces on Rubicon don't take kindly to war profiteers looking to steal the coral. So your rocket gets shot down by a satellite before you can reach your destination. When you touch down, you need to find a license to operate legally on the planet and get to work for whichever side pays you the most. All of this is told to you through voiceover and video logs, as you never see any actual people, just their ACs. It's not my favorite method for narrative delivery, but after years of playing Destiny, it's a thing I'm already very well acquainted with, so it didn't bother me much. It lets you hone in on what's most important. The extremely fast and dynamic action happening right in front of you. This isn't the most beautiful game in the world, but it's far from looking bad. FromSoft knows how to flex their creative muscles when it comes to strong art direction, and that art direction is really good at masking any shortcomings in sheer graphical fidelity that people might want to point out. The world and the geography might feel a little bland in places, but that also stems directly from the story they're trying to tell. This planet has been engulfed in flames and ravaged by unending wars. It's not going to look pretty. And while you're playing with the game in motion, your last concern will be about how the trees look too unrealistic or that the texture on the buildings looks too flat. You'll be far too busy admiring the awesome explosion effects and the badass weaponry. Armored Core 6's campaign is structured through individual missions called sorties, a stark shift from the big open spaces that most modern From fans will be familiar with. Each sortie can be completed pretty quickly once you get a feel for your new mechanical chassis, averaging at about 5 to 10 minutes. And there's even checkpointing at key moments in longer missions. If you happen to die and get sent back to one, you get your 3 repair kits from the beginning of the mission refilled, and you're allowed to rework your AC's loadout from the parts you have available. Sorties come in a variety of content styles. Most will have you hunting down a specific enemy or knocking out a base full of smaller units and artillery, and some will have you tracking down information and fighting alongside one of the many factions of Rubicon. The standard flow of a mission starts with taking out a handful of smaller targets while evading ranged enemy fire, running into some kind of bigger, tougher enemy to deal with, and then dismantling them with a combination of firepower and tactical movement. But then there are the missions that really stand out from the pack. The coolest ones by far either use massive set pieces to give you a better idea of the scale that you're operating within, or those that pit you against an enemy who's on even footing with you. These really test your abilities and can punish overly zealous players for not strategizing and bringing the right weapon to the fight. If having enough firepower isn't your problem, you might want to take up the training missions that appear as you progress. They can teach you very important details about specific parts you can equip, such as how the different styles of legs affect the way that your AC operates, or what each of the 3 damage types across all the weapons are good for. They also give you new parts to use for free, just for taking the time out to practice. And of course, none of this matters if you don't step into the AC design and parts shop in the garage. Designing your AC's assembly is the most important part of the game. You can get away with a lot in the earlier missions as far as builds go, but you'll really want to narrow them down later when the game throws more complicated fights at you. There isn't really a single design that works as a skeleton key for all situations, so being stubborn about switching things up only works against your best interests. You can toss on a bunch of lightweight limbs and weapons to pressure enemies with close range fire, or slap on a set of tank treads and load up as much heavy artillery as you can carry, or put as much distance between you and the enemy as possible and pick them off with rifles. Is the place where you're fighting filled with buildings and obstacles? Maybe you'll want to throw on some tetrapod legs to hover over the enemy, or pick shoulder-mounted missile launchers that fire vertically and track downwards. Are you in an open area with little to no cover? No problem. Grab some reverse-jointed legs and dance circles around your targets while chipping away at their health. Some of the other components, like the generator and the FCS unit, might seem unexciting, but they're vitally important if you want to tune your AC properly. The stats page looks intimidating at a glance, but it is absolutely worth figuring out how all of the stats affect you. Your balance of weight, energy, and the distance at which your targeting system remains locked on can completely change how you play. AC assembly is critical to your success, but if you're anything like me, you'll spend much longer in the cosmetics menus to make your big stompy robot look awesome. You can choose the colors, the patterns, luster, and weathering of each individual part. You can even design your own decals and stick them anywhere you want. Just remember they'll get messed up anytime you swap components. I think my biggest complaint about the decals is that there isn't a way to vertically mirror them across your AC, which means you'll spend a very long time trying to find an exact angle and set of coordinates if you want everything to look evenly balanced. And now,
let me introduce you to my crowning achievement. I call her Armored Corn.
Maybe this joke that took 3 hours to set up is too corny, but is it as corny as asking people to like the video and subscribe? I'll leave that up to you. After you've played through most of Chapter 1, you'll also unlock the Arena. These are one-on-one fights against virtual recreations of other pilots' ACs who you fight throughout the rest of the game. Winning these gives you OS tuning chips, which can be spent on components that give your AC a specialized mechanic, like a barrier shield or the ability to kick enemies at the end of your assault dash. Overall, it has a pretty healthy amount of gameplay styles, with pacing that doesn't get stale. The fact that you can complete a mission in just a few minutes means that even if you don't really gel with the current objective, you can move on to the next thing very quickly. But the game does really push you to replay missions, whether it's to nail down an S ranking or just to farm money for new components. The good news is that you can replay any of the missions as many times as you want for money. For me, that meant wrecking the poor AC tester pilot dozens of times because he can be overcome in 2 minutes or less for about 80,000 credits.
I just wanted a call sign of my own.
Most of the early sorties you'll be sent on don't pose much of a challenge. The game eases you into learning the ridiculously complicated controls and what all the HUD elements are there for. They also tell you about the lock-on system, but in my opinion, they don't give you enough information or time with it before the first major encounter. You see, there's a standard soft lock, which bounces your tracking between any enemies within your frontal view, and a hard lock, which will keep you faced towards a single target at all times. It doesn't do a great job of explaining that you should never touch the right stick again after you've initiated the hard lock with an R3 stick press, because you'll revert back to soft locking and completely lose your aim. The first time you'll learn this hard lesson is with the tutorial boss at the end of the very first mission. It's a massive helicopter that hovers above the battlefield, absolutely rattling your AC with machine gun fire and missiles. You can strafe boost to avoid most of its attacks on the ground, but going on the offensive proves difficult if you don't understand what the game wants you to do. The boss stays still for a short time, but then likes to zip away to the other sides of the arena, and if you weren't hard locked, it's easy to completely lose track of where it's at. The most effective way to deal with this would be, of course, to hard lock onto it, but if you use the assault boost to catch up to it while hard locked, you end up flying directly towards it in the air where it can easily gun you down. The lesson that the game doesn't state outright is that you should stay soft locked until you can make your way underneath the boss and then hard lock onto it, assault boosting and using your sword to break its stagger gauge. It feels likely that a lot of people will get discouraged within the first hour of the game if they don't use cover, another thing that's not talked about enough, or learn to strafe and approach effectively. Lucky for me, it only took 3 attempts before I figured out what I was doing wrong. I wish From Software hadn't dipped back into their make the beginning of the game difficult just for the sake of being difficult philosophy, again, just because their core audience expects it to be that way. I'm not saying AC6 isn't allowed to be difficult, but it feels unusually harsh this early on when the controls are so vastly different from 99% of modern games. This is sure to be many people's first Armored Core game, and punishing them for not understanding how your weird camera works and not giving them the chance to breathe just doesn't feel right. Besides, it will get much more difficult once you reach the boss that caps off Chapter 1. Bearing in mind that each attempt only runs from about 2 to 3 minutes each, this dude took me roughly 2 hours to conquer while playing extremely aggressively with a very specific loadout. I have no idea how you're supposed to beat this guy using other methods, because this fight is essentially a bullet hell where the smallest stagger window can spell your death. Arguments over difficulty aside, the soundtrack that carries you through the missions is alright. It plays a little too subtle for my taste, but it's appropriate nonetheless. It's pretty much all heavy synths, with some 80s rock and metal undertones straight out of something like the Terminator or Blade Runner movies. The bassy pounding and occasional off-tune shifts mesh well with the frantic gunfights and steely noir setting that you'll be exploring. The sound design is really satisfying. All the impacts are crunchy and weighty, and the guns all have really distinct audio associated with them. Whether it's the revving of Gatling guns, the buzzing and crackling of energy swords, or the alert tones warning you of incoming missiles, the sounds fully immerse you in the cockpit of your AC while simultaneously acting as an invaluable asset to your fighting skills. I really enjoyed Armored Core 6, and I hope to get back to it soon, but man, I feel like it couldn't have been released at a more awkward time. Between Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield and the handful of other interesting games coming out, Armored Core feels like the game with the highest potential to get backlogged, and that's a real shame. As for now, I'll just say that my first impressions of Armored Core 6 Fires of Rubicon run very high. It's not a style of game or genre that I normally get excited by, but I'm really glad that I dove in this time around. This game shows that From Software are still fully capable of generating awesome experiences that aren't reliant on any single formula. I think it's awesome that they've become such a big household name over the last few years that they can now afford to experiment with more projects with niche audiences. And they can be the ones to widen that audience in the same way they've already pioneered for the Souls-like genre.